Sarah hadn't slept in 47 hours. She sat hunched over her desk at 2:15 a.m. on Saturday morning, surrounded by a fortress of medical textbooks, psychology journals, and printouts from every sleep disorder website she could find. Empty coffee cups formed a defensive perimeter around her workspace, their cold dregs testament to her desperate attempt to maintain consciousness through chemical warfare. Her bedroom had been transformed into a makeshift research laboratory. Charts covered the walls, hand-drawn diagrams mapping the connections between REM sleep, dream states, and unexplained deaths. Newspaper clippings from the Springwood Library archives were spread across her bed like tarot cards, each one documenting another cluster of teenage deaths that had occurred every 20 years with clockwork precision. The pattern was undeniable, but Sarah's analytical mind rebelled against the supernatural implications. There had to be a scientific explanation, some kind of shared psychotic episode, mass hysteria, environmental contamination that affected dream states. Something rational, something she could understand and therefore defeat. But Tommy's death had shattered that delusion. She'd seen his face at the wake, seen the terror frozen in his features, and known with absolute certainty that he'd died from something far worse than cardiac arrest. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the page of her neurology textbook, the words blurring together as exhaustion played tricks with her vision. She'd consumed enough caffeine to kill a rhino, but her body was beginning to shut down despite her chemical assistance. Her eyelids felt like lead weights, and every few minutes her head would nod forward before jerking back up as her survival instincts kicked in. The house around her was silent except for the hum of her desk lamp and the occasional creak of settling wood. Her parents had gone to bed hours ago, trusting their perfect daughter to maintain her usual study schedule. A photograph on her nightstand caught her eye. Sarah and her younger self at last year's academic award ceremony, both of them beaming as she accepted the valedictorian trophy. The girl in the picture looked confident, invincible, secure in the knowledge that hard work could overcome any obstacle. Sarah forced her attention back to the textbook, but the words began to swim on the page. The section on sleep paralysis became a jumbled mess of syllables that made no sense. Her vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges as her exhausted brain demanded the rest she couldn't afford to give it. She slapped herself hard across the face, the sharp pain driving back the encroaching unconsciousness. Her cheek stung, but the physical sensation anchored her to waking reality. She'd done this 17 times since midnight, leaving her face red and swollen. The clock on her desk ticked over to 2:31 a.m. Sarah stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair in her haste to keep moving. Physical activity might help, jumping jacks, push-ups, anything to get her blood flowing and fight off the overwhelming urge to sleep. She began pacing back and forth across her small bedroom, stepping over the scattered research materials like obstacles in some demented maze. But even as she moved, her mind continued working on the problem. The entity displayed intelligence, memory, and the ability to access deeply personal information about its victims. It targeted specific psychological vulnerabilities with accuracy, suggesting neither supernatural omniscience or an extensive period of observation and study. Tommy's death had been perfectly tailored to his athletic identity and his complicated relationship with his father. The thing knew about Frank Harrison's abusive training methods, knew about Tommy's secret rage and helplessness. It had used that knowledge to construct a nightmare so personally devastating that Tommy's psyche had simply shattered under the assault. Which meant Sarah's death would find her deepest fears and use them as weapons. She resumed pacing, but her movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. Her legs felt like rubber, and twice she had to catch herself against the wall to keep from falling. The caffeine crash was hitting hard now, leaving her system flooded with fatigue toxins that no amount of willpower could overcome. 2:47 a.m. Sarah tried to focus on her breathing, using techniques she'd learned in yoga class to maintain alertness. But each breath seemed to pull her deeper into relaxation, her body instinctively preparing for the sleep it so desperately needed. She bit down on her tongue, hard enough to draw blood. The metallic taste filled her mouth, sharp and immediate, but even that pain was beginning to feel distant and unimportant. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw movement in the shadows beyond her desk lamp's circle of light. Something tall and thin shifting position, watching her. But when she blinked and looked again, there was nothing there except the familiar shapes of her furniture. Sarah stumbled back to her desk and grabbed another textbook, Advanced Cognitive Psychology, flipping through pages that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics for all the sense they made to her oxygen-starved brain. The chapter on consciousness and altered states of awareness seemed relevant, but the academic language had become impenetrable. Words like phenomenological and neuroplasticity blurred together into meaningless syllables that her tired mind couldn't process. She was losing the battle, and she knew it. 3:03 a.m. Sarah's head dropped onto the open textbook, her cheek pressing against a diagram of brain wave patterns during REM sleep. She jerked awake immediately, leaving a small puddle of drool on the page, but the moment of unconsciousness had been enough. The transition was seamless. 1 second she was at her desk fighting exhaustion, the next she was lying on a cold metal examination table under blazing fluorescent lights. The room around her was sterile white, filled with medical equipment that hummed and beeped with mechanical precision. Four stands flanked her table like chrome sentinels, their bags filled with fluids that definitely weren't saline. The liquid inside was dark red, almost black, and it pulsed with its own rhythm as if it were alive. Sarah tried to move but found herself restrained by leather straps that bit into her wrists and ankles. The metal table was ice cold against her skin, and she realized with mounting horror that she was wearing nothing but a thin hospital gown that provided no warmth or modesty. "Subject is conscious and responsive," a voice announced from somewhere beyond the circle of harsh light. "Vital signs are elevated but stable. Brain activity is off the charts, exactly what we'd expect from our little perfectionist." Figures moved in the shadows beyond the examination table, doctors in white coats, or at least things wearing the shape of doctors. Their faces remained hidden in darkness, but Sarah could see their hands as they reached for instruments on surgical trays. The flesh was burned and scarred, fingers ending in what looked more like claws than human nails. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to study. I have tests to take, papers to write." "Oh, sweetie," one of the shadow doctors replied with obvious amusement, "you're taking the ultimate test now. The final exam, you might say." More laughter echoed through the sterile room, but it was wrong somehow, too synchronized, too hollow, like the sound of air being forced through damaged vocal cords. A surgical lamp swiveled into position above her head, its brightness so intense that tears streamed from her eyes. She could feel the heat from the bulb on her face, smell the ozone it produced, hear the electrical buzz that seemed to resonate inside her skull. "Let's see what we're working with," another voice said, and Sarah felt cold metal touch her forehead. "Standard cranial examination, specimen 847B, subject shows classic signs of academic obsession with underlying perfectionist pathology." The scalpel, for that's what it had to be, began to trace a line across her hairline. Sarah expected pain, but what she felt was worse, a cold, clinical detachment as if her body no longer belonged to her. She could feel the blade parting her scalp, could smell the copper scent of her own blood, but the sensation seemed to be happening to someone else. "Interesting," the voice continued as the incision deepened. "Remarkable stress fractures in the cranial structure. This subject has been pushing herself well beyond normal human limits." "What do you expect?" a third voice chimed in. "Look at her academic record. 4.0 GPA, 7 AP classes, president of 3 different clubs. The pressure must have been enormous." Sarah tried to scream, but her vocal cords seemed paralyzed. She could only watch in horror as her own scalp was peeled back like the cover of a book, exposing the pulsing gray matter beneath. My, the first voice said with obvious delight. "Look at that beautiful brain. So organized, so compartmentalized. Every piece of knowledge filed away in its proper place." Cold air touched her exposed brain, and Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before, the actual physical sensation of thoughts being handled, memories being lifted out and examined like specimens in a laboratory. Here we have her multiplication tables, one of the doctors announced, holding up what looked like a strand of silver wire that pulsed with electric current. Memorized at age 6. Very impressive for such a young child. And here, another voice said, her periodic table of elements. Complete with atomic weights and electron configurations. How wonderfully thorough. They were removing her memories, Sarah realized with growing terror. Everything she'd ever learned, every fact she'd memorized, every skill she'd developed, it was all being taken out of her head and examined like artifacts from an archaeological dig. The French vocabulary is particularly well organized, a fourth voice observed. Color-coded by grammatical function. This subject was definitely obsessive-compulsive about her studies. Sarah felt herself becoming lighter, emptier, as more and more of her accumulated knowledge was extracted. The mathematical formulas that had once been second nature to her were gone. The historical dates she'd memorized were missing. Even basic concepts like reading and writing seemed to be slipping away as the doctors continued their systematic ransacking of her mind. Now for the really interesting stuff, the first voice said, and Sarah saw a familiar burned face lean into the circle of light. The creature that had haunted her dreams for days smiled down at her with those sharpened teeth, its flame-filled eye sockets casting shadows on the examination room walls. "Let's see what you're really made of, Brainiac," it said, reaching into her open skull with one clawed hand. "All those A's, all that studying, all that pressure to be perfect. But you know what? None of it matters now." The thing pulled out a large section of Sarah's brain, the part that contained her sense of identity, her understanding of who she was and what she valued. It examined the gray matter with the casual interest of a scientist studying a lab specimen. "Look at this," it said with cruel amusement. "So much fear of failure. So much terror of disappointing mommy and daddy. So much anxiety about not being smart enough, not working hard enough, not achieving enough." It squeezed the brain tissue, and Sarah felt her sense of self begin to dissolve. The part of her that had always known she was Sarah Mitchell, valedictorian candidate, future neurosurgeon, began to fade away. "All those A's and you still can't figure out how to wake up," the creature taunted, tossing the piece of brain tissue into a metal pan where it landed with a wet splat. "Pop quiz, sweetheart, what's the square root of terror?" Sarah tried to answer, tried to demonstrate that she still retained some fragment of her intelligence, but the words wouldn't come. The mathematical concepts that had once been as natural as breathing were simply gone, leaving behind empty spaces where her knowledge used to live. "Oh, this is rich," the thing continued, reaching deeper into her skull. "Look at all these beautiful memories of academic success. Spelling bee victories, science fair ribbons, honor roll certificates. All those little gold stars that made you feel so special." It began pulling out memory after memory, each one dissolving into nothingness as it left her brain. Sarah watched her entire academic career disappear: first grade reading awards, middle school math competitions, high school debate trophies. Every achievement that had defined her identity was being systematically erased. "The perfectionist pathology runs deep," one of the shadow doctors observed. "Classic case of identity fusion with academic performance. Remove the achievements, and there's almost nothing left of the core personality." "Please," Sarah managed to whisper, though she could barely remember why she was begging or what she was begging for. I studied so hard." "And where did it get you?" the burned thing asked with mock sympathy. "Tell me, genius, did they cover this scenario in AP psychology?" It reached into the deepest part of her mind now, into the primal core where her most basic memories lived. Sarah felt her childhood being extracted, first words, first steps, the pride in her parents' eyes when she'd learned to read before kindergarten. All of it was being taken away, leaving behind an empty shell. "Here's the best part," the creature said, holding up what looked like a small, pulsing organ. "Her sense of self-worth. Completely dependent on external validation, on grades and test scores and other people's approval. Take that away, and what's left? It crushed the organ in its clawed hand, and Sarah felt the last vestiges of her identity crumble away. She was no longer a student, no longer anything at all. Just empty consciousness. The patient appears to be experiencing complete ego dissolution, one of the doctors announced clinically. Brain matter is becoming increasingly fluid. Suggest we expedite the extraction process. Sarah's remaining thoughts began to spill out of her open skull, pooling on the examination table in dark puddles that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights. Her memories, her very sense of being, all of it flowed away until there was nothing left but an empty vessel that had once contained a human mind. Time of death, the burn thing announced, checking a watch made of human bone, 3:47 a.m. Cause, academic pressure exceeding structural limits of cranial capacity. In layman's terms, she studied herself to death. The creature's laughter followed Sarah into the darkness, a sound like chalk scraping on blackboards that would echo in her failing synapses until the very last spark of consciousness finally guttered out. Patricia Mitchell found her daughter's body at 6:30 a.m. when she came to wake Sarah for her scheduled SAT prep course. The girl was slumped over her desk, pen still in hand, having apparently fallen asleep while studying. The official cause of death would be listed as brain aneurysm, a rare but not unheard of condition in high-achieving students under extreme academic pressure. The coroner noted the unusual amount of stress hormones in Sarah's system, evidence of the toll that perfectionist tendencies could take on a developing mind. What he didn't note in his report was the sheet of paper beneath Sarah's lifeless hand, covered with her name written over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting until the words devolved into meaningless scribbles and finally into nothing but random marks that looked disturbingly like brain matter splattered across the page. Her parents would mourn the loss of their brilliant daughter, their plans for her future success dying with her. But they would never understand that in her final moments, Sarah had lost more than her life. She had lost every memory, every thought, every piece of knowledge that had ever made her who she was. In death, she had finally achieved the emptiness that her perfectionist mind had always secretly feared. The test was over, and she had failed.